Did you know Gaelic was once spoken the edge of the world? Fáilte go Carl's LingQ kingdom is misha Carl agus hamia gonsachug na Gaelic, Japanish agus Cumrish. The small set of islands at the edge of the world that I'm talking about is actually referred to as St. Kilda, or in Gaelic, Hiorta. And you can see it on the map right here, far reaches of the Outer Hebrides. St. Kilda is famous nowadays for being the UK's largest colony of Atlantic puffins, or puhech. As my mate Tommy Mackay explains in his article at The Scotsman, St. Kilda is one of Scotland's 6 UNESCO World Heritage Sites. I could tell you about how Hiorta has these giant sea stacks and how one of them forms the highest sea cliff in Britain, but instead I want to talk to you about the rich and unique Gaelic culture that St. Kilda once had and how they lost it forever. If you lived on one of the islands of St. Kilda or Hiorta, it was a harsh life. People survived mostly on sheep and seabirds like the puhech I mentioned, and guga and other species. In fact, the National Record of Scotland shows that in a 1764 census, each resident ate 36 eggs and 18 birds a day. That's a lot of birds. The inhabitants of Hiorta would daringly climb the cliffs using just ropes and their bare hands in order to harvest the birds and the birds' eggs. And they also lived inside
Taken
or the traditional Hebridean black houses, which are unique because it's where the animals and the people lived, and it had no windows in order to help insulate it and keep it warm. And it was heated by a single peat fire, which was never allowed to go out. People have lived on the islands of Hiorta for thousands of years, and for most of that time it was primarily Gaelic speaking. Even up into the mid-1800s, it was a Gaelic-only island because it was so remote. For example, the minister on Hiorta from 1830 to 1844, Neil Mackenzie, was the only person on the island who spoke English. And so if the islanders wanted to communicate outside the island with somebody who didn't have any Gaelic, it would have to go through him. It wasn't even until 1906 that they got a school where every single child was able to learn English on St. Kilda. And so St. Kilda had this strong Gaelic community for all these centuries, and because of their remoteness, they even developed their own kind of distinct dialect. And I'm going to give you some hints of what that dialect may have sounded like. So first I'll start off with the kind of normal, or at least semi-standard Gaelic pronunciation, and then I'll follow that up with the extinct St. Kildan dialect example. So first we have lav, or hand in Gaelic, but on St. Kilda this was pronounced wav, or dlo, meaning like a handful of something. In Hiorta Gaelic that becomes dwo, dlo, dwo, or the word for blind, dal. In St. Kildan Gaelic that becomes daw. You can see with a lot of these words that they kind of take a l sound and turn it into a w. Here's a different switch of sound that they also did in Hiorta. The Gaelic word for a drink, gioch. In St. Kildan Gaelic this would be gioch, gioch, gioch. So they switched the j to a g kind of sound. And finally, they even had different names for places compared to what we would nowadays, looking back, would consider to be semi-standard Gaelic. So Inverness in Scotland, normally we would refer to it as Inhirnish, right? But in Hiorta, they would say Eilinish instead of Inhirnish. Nowadays, some scholars even think that the language on Hiorta was influenced potentially by Norwegian, or like an early form of Icelandic, and that could extend even to the name of the islands themselves, because in Gaelic, Hiorta, that we use to describe those islands in that cluster for St. Kilda, might come from the Norwegian word hirtir, which means a stag, like a deer. And I mean, if you look at it, those sea stacks and islands poking out of the ocean, it kind of could look like antlers, right? Now, the origins of the name for St. Kilda, whether you're talking about the English St. Kilda or you're talking about Hiorta the origins of that are still hotly debated by the scholars in those fields. But if you want to learn more about the Hiorta dialect of Gaelic and even hear some recordings of some native St. Kildans, or Hiorstich, of them speaking Gaelic, then I got some links down in the description below of the research that I did, and you can listen to those recordings yourself. So why did this holdout of old Gaelic culture die off? Well, there never really were a ton of people on the islands because they're kind of small and they're very remote. And so by the end of World War I, most of the young adults on the island had moved away. And so the population dwindled further and further to the point where there weren't enough people to take care of the animals that they had or to hunt the birds that were there. And so you've got all this very harsh weather, which meant it's hard to get supplies, it's hard to get mail in. And the remaining folks on the island eventually decided, they're like, we don't have enough people here to survive the winter. So they voted to abandon the island, and the last inhabitants of Hiorta left in, I think it was 1930. Even today, there's no one who lives permanently on Hiorta. You've got some scientists who were there seasonally to study the birds, and you can still go as a tourist to visit, but the remains of those Gaelic settlements, those houses, are still there on St. Kilda, but only as empty shells. Hiorta houses the fossil of a dead Gaelic culture. And if we want to make sure that the rest of Gaelic doesn't die, we need to continue to learn and promote Gaelic as a living language, both in Scotland and in the Scottish diaspora. You know, people like me and my children that I'm raising to speak Gaelic. Just like that peat fire in the Taich Du, we've got to make sure that the fire of Gaelic doesn't go out, so we can pass it on to more generations. Gaidhlig Gubra. So mash that like button if you are intrigued by the tragic story of Hiorta, and let me know down in the comments if you think you want to visit St. Kilda someday. Finally, I mentioned that Hiorta is just one of 6 UNESCO World Heritage Sites that Scotland has. To get a glimpse of what the other 5 are, click on the link down in the description to read Tommy Mackay's article at The Scotsman. Chimia riasche a